We need to think about this not only as a women's rights issue, but it's an economic justice issue too, for sure, healthcare issue, 100%. But we're also talking about the erosion of democracy. And this is about taking away women's rights. It's about taking away freedoms too. And what I see happening is this is just one example of many ways that our freedom and democracy is being eroded. And they should be red flags and warning signs that our democracy is under threat. And that things that we took for granted that, like, of course this wouldn't happen in the United States, they're happening. And we need to be paying attention.
It's important to be part of a union because you have to have a voice.
Welcome to Union Talk. I'm Randi Weingarten.
Welcome to Union Talk. It's Women's History Month, and just like these other months, it's a time that we look back at the history of women's rights and suffragettes and where we have to go and where we've been. And today we're going to look at both the progress and the challenges that women have gone through for decades, generations, and centuries. But we're also going to look at what the promise is. And I have two amazing guests that are going to help me do this. But there's no mistake that there's been decades of struggle, marching, yes, victories, but some real troubling times ahead. And I would say that one of the most impending crises that we face in America was the impact of the reversal of Roe v. Wade by the Dobbs decision and all of the impacts that that has clearly on reproductive health, clearly on choices about how to and when to raise a family. But it also has huge implications, economic implications, implications around freedom. And I have two guests who I will introduce momentarily who are going to talk about that. And this is going to be one of our best episodes ever. But let me just situate this for a second to say with a few statistics. In 2022, American women still typically earned 82 cents for every dollar earned by men. 75% of women have been sexually assaulted. That's not 100 years ago. That's today's data. Maternal mortality rates in the United States nearly doubled. Yes, not gone down, but nearly doubled from 17.4% in 2018 to 32.9% in 2021. And that's per 100,000 live births. So there's still a big conversation about equality and about dignity. And on top of that, you have the environment in which we are in. And none other than one of the candidates who is the putative nominee for the Republican nomination, Donald Trump, over and over again, claims credit for the reversal of Roe v. Wade because of who he selected and who was confirmed by the Senate for the Supreme Court of America. Himself, by the way, a man who's been convicted of sexual assault. So there's no surprise that we're in a moment, as we're in this Women's History Month 2024, a moment of great challenge. And that's why I've invited Laura Wiederhoeft, who is a registered nurse at Planned Parenthood and a member of the Wisconsin Federation of Nurses and Health Professionals, and Jessica Tang, the president of the Boston Teachers Union and the first person of color, the first woman, the first openly queer leader to hold that position. And as you can tell, we're all union members, but that's why I've asked Jessica and Laura to join me. But let me just talk for a minute about the aftermath of Roe. It's no surprise that the three of us see reproductive rights as an essential right, one that not only allows women to have autonomy over their bodies and their lives, but that this should be not a question of legality, but a question of moral right and value. And so it's not just activists. We believe that this is a moral right, and this should not ever have been a legal issue. But we are where we are right now, and think about the implications that has happened because of the reversal of Roe. It doesn't just stop with abortion. If you think about the decades-long push, there has been now revived a decades-long push to restrict contraception like IUDs and Plan B. And look at what has just happened in terms of the IVF fight. IVF is something that up until the Alabama court decision was broadly accepted, regardless of ideology, as a way to help people create families. And the fact that one would actually rule, as the Alabama court did, that embryos had the same rights as children. Think about what that has done to families and family planning and to women all over the country. The criminalization of abortion and reproductive health care has been chilling. One of my college friends has represented women in these criminalization battles for decades. And what she's seeing today is what we saw 30 and 40 years ago. But what it's also done is not just for the individual women and families that are facing that. Think about all of the healthcare workers and what they're facing as well. And the choices that they have to make, where what they do is they try to create health and dignity. And now they're facing these massive questions about their own liberty if they are trying to save people's lives or help women raise families or make choices themselves. This politically motivated intrusion in the relationship between patient care and their care interferes with everything. It's political interference at the bedside. It's political interference in the most intimate of decisions that families make. And it's political interference with freedom and with justice. And one wonders, why do other people want to control women so much in 2024? So whether what we're talking about today is simply, should women be able to determine their own fate and control their own bodies? And so when we're talking about whether it's the right to vote, the ability to work in or outside the home, the freedom of opening one's own bank account, all of these things are fights that women and our allies have had to wage over all these years. I also want to say one of the most amazing women, the first woman who ran for president of the United States, Shirley Chisholm. There is a movie that has now been made about her, and it's on Netflix, just like Rustin was on Netflix, and it opens March 22nd. And I commend all of you to go see it. And if you haven't ever learned anything about Shirley Chisholm, you'll learn a lot about her now. But just a little reminder, take some tissues. It's a real tearjerker. So Jessica and Laura, I've noticed we're doing this. We're looking at each other as we're doing this. I've noticed you've been shaking your heads in, we've been like the Hallelujah chorus here and, or the Amen choir here. And I didn't even talk about mifepristone and all of those issues. But let me welcome to Union Talk. And I'm just so happy to have both of you. So I want to just rewind to 2022 for a second and ask both of you what you thought when, I know we had a preview about Roe being overturned because the, draft opinion had been released. But what were your first thoughts when you saw that Roe had been overturned? Laura, why don't I start with you and then Jess, and then each time I'll reverse it some.
Yeah. So we had patients in our waiting room waiting for their appointments, for counseling visits, for abortion visits. And we had to tell those people to go home, that they couldn't have their appointment that day. So my first thoughts were for those people, for our patients, because that's what our jobs are about, is about the people we take care of every day. And we had to turn them away. And it was devastating. The only word that I can really use to describe it is grief. We sat in our clinic lobby pretty much the whole day and cried and talked to each other because there was nothing else to do. We didn't have any patients to take care of. And it was a collective moment that we knew was coming, but we didn't know when. And knowing something is coming is obviously not the same thing as living through it. And it really was just collective grief and fear for our patients and wondering, what are these people going to do at this point? Because in Wisconsin, we couldn't perform abortions as soon as Roe fell.
What was, for our listeners, would you just tell them what the law was in Wisconsin that Roe overturned and when it was established?
Yes.
I think people have no idea what the tumultuous effect of the overturning of Roe was.
Yeah. So Wisconsin was a unique case. We have a law on the books from 1849 that is controversial. So some people interpret it as saying that abortion is illegal. And due to all the risks of felony convictions and so on and so forth, my organization made the decision to not take those risks and not perform abortions after our protection of Roe fell. So Wisconsin reverted to an 1849 law, which is just, women couldn't vote. It's totally archaic.
It was crazy. But let me just say, it is so cool to have you as members of the AFT.
Yes,
so
thank you.
Really,
we're thrilled.
We so love it.
We're thrilled.
And Jess, what about your first thoughts?
Yeah, I'm like thinking back, and this issue has been deeply personal to me for many reasons. One, my sister's actually an OBGYN in family planning and was really, she's been following us obviously very closely. So we knew this was coming, as you had mentioned. But the immediate reaction, I think, is just, yes, 100% grief, because I actually know what it feels like to be one of those patients. And, I can share a little bit more about that. But two, anger. I was really angry because I knew what so many women would have to go through now. And also thinking of our healthcare providers, my sister had to think really hard about, where her name is public and what name she uses, because of before, Dobbs, there was already a lot of danger, I guess I could call it, and risks for healthcare providers. And I think this has created an even more terrible climate for them as well, for everybody. And so definitely, just fear, anger, and just really shock that we were somehow going backwards in 2022.
And you just referred to it, and I know you've been pretty public about your own struggle with fertility. And for those who are listening, I would not be asking Jessica this question if she hadn't pre-cleared me for being able to ask it. So, we're not, this is a podcast amongst really amazing union members, and we're all kind of in the family together. But Jess, since you raised it, why don't you talk a little bit about, both of you talked about the fear, this kind of fear that kind of rises from our own experiences. And as you're collecting your thoughts, I will never forget our convention was in Boston that year, and there had been real debate, since we have lots of people from lots of places in the country who are ideologically, I would say, probably to the right of the three of us on this podcast. And there was some real discussions about how hard we were going to go in terms of our condemnation of Roe v. Wade's overturning and the implications of it. And the Women's Committee of the AFT said, we're taking this on and we're going to the floor, and we don't actually care what you're doing, Executive Council. This is something that we feel really strongly about. And we crafted with the Women's Committee a special order of business. And I've never seen in recent memory at our conventions a committee meeting that was so not only alive, riveting, and intense in emotion and overflowing, like so many people were at that meeting. And then when the resolution got to the floor, how many people took the mics and told their personal stories about what had happened to them. Leaders that we know in the union, that we know as labor leaders or as leaders of locals, coming up and saying, well, this is what happened to me 20 years ago, and I needed to have an abortion, and I needed to, and you could hear with these stories, pins dropping of people saying, oh my God, like, because so much has been hidden for so long, and so much, even with Casey and so many other cases, we figured it out. That's who we are. But Jess, turning it over to you.
Yeah. So the timing of all this was, I think, really difficult for me too. So my first pregnancy, I had a miscarriage, which is so much more common than people realize. And it's just, again, one of those subjects that people just don't talk about, even though so many women are going through a lot of grief when they have these miscarriages. Right. And then I had a second pregnancy, and I was so happy. It was a highly desired pregnancy, and everything was going fine until about 17 and a half weeks. I learned that my baby had a very rare brain cyst. And at that point, it's so rare. There's not a lot of research actually on it, or not a lot of cases. But the hope was that if it remained small, that the prognosis would still be positive. And so I chose at that point, there were risks, but it was a highly desired pregnancy and I wanted to continue. So I did. And at 23 weeks, the cyst had grown a bit. And I had a choice then. And in Massachusetts at that time, after 24 weeks, you couldn't have an abortion. And this is in Massachusetts, by the way, in 2019. I just want to point that out. And I, again, was hopeful. And, they said, there might be risks of, disabilities, et cetera. But I was like, okay, I still want to go forward. So I did. Around 28 weeks, things went really south. The cyst grew exponentially. And at 30 weeks, I was getting regular, ultrasounds at this point. The cyst had grown so much that the weight, I guess, was pulling his spinal cord into his skull.
Yeah.
And they were like, he's not going to make it. And so I was left with very terrible choices.
Yeah.
I didn't want to actually speak publicly about a lot of this, but I'll tell you why I eventually did, because it's still hard to talk about even today. So, all my options were terrible, right? It was like, continue the pregnancy, but his spine would snap, and then I'd have to have emergency surgery, I could try to do a C-section, and that's originally what I wanted to do. In fact, I actually went in until it was hooked up to the IV and everything and ready to do it. But when they told me what was happen next, I couldn't continue with that because they were like, maybe experimental surgery. And then I learned about comfort care and what that entailed. And I was like, I couldn't do that. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't do what, I couldn't do it. So my only option was to fly to Colorado.
Yeah.
So I had to fly to Colorado the next day. And that's how I was able to get a third-term abortion. And I'm part of the 1% of women who end up getting a third-term abortion. And I can tell you, if you're in your third term, you really wanted that pregnancy. Abortion is not something you wanted to have to even consider or think about at that point. And so it breaks my heart every single time I read these stories about women who, one, can't afford to travel, two, are being told, well, we can't do anything until your baby passes away, even though we know your baby's not going to make it. Just think about the mental toll that takes on a woman. I just cannot describe that. And what I'm happy to say, though, is that in Massachusetts, because we knew that, the Roe and Dobbs, Rose was under, attack and that Dobbs could happen. The Massachusetts was fighting for the Roe Act, which is state legislation that not only codified the current, the existing laws at that time, but also expanded it. And it got rid of some of the judicial hoops that women had to take if they wanted to get an abortion without going to see a judge, without parental consent. But it also expanded late-term abortions finally. And so today in Massachusetts, I wouldn't have to do that. But at that point, when it happened to me, I did have to go to Colorado. And so that, I guess, is the silver lining. But that's why I started speaking up, because in Massachusetts at that time, I was like, this has to pass. And so I started to share my story. And it wasn't easy because there's a lot of shame too. I mean, I come from a Catholic household and, I didn't know what people would think, but I felt like finally I had to speak up because so many women suffer so silently. And, and so the last piece of the story, I actually can tell the story without crying, but I'm getting a little emotional now because, I also empathize with the women going through IVF because, I've since been able to have a child spontaneously, and Randy's met him. He's Dougie, and I love
Dougie.
Right. But I wanted to have a second child. And I found out yesterday that I had 6 frozen eggs and none of my embryos made it. And so I just found that out yesterday. So I'm feeling a little,
I'm sorry, Jess.
Just a little more emotional than usual. And, but that is why I also was following what was happening in Alabama and just empathizing so much with the women who, were going through that process of IVF and having things halted to be told, that you're like, that you can't continue or that what you're hoping is going to happen will be in question. I mean,
it's crazy.
It is crazy.
Well, look, the fact that you've shared your story and the pain of it publicly has actually helped not only other people, but it also puts such a human face onto decisions that politicians should have no right to be involved in. No right. And no right to control. And I think what happens is when people are as courageous as you've been, Jess, and you can see it on your face every time you talk about this, it helps create not only support, but a solidarity and an awareness that's so vitally important right now. So really, thank you. Thank you for doing that. Really, thank you. I know I'm going to ask a whole bunch of other questions, but I really didn't want to leave that question for the end. So I hope the two of you didn't mind that. I'm going to ask both of you because we saw immediately, the results around the country that almost immediately in 22 and 23, there were states like Kansas that were able to get things, ballot initiatives, constitutional amendments, other statutory changes, things on the ballot because they knew they couldn't use their legislatures because of all of the gerrymandering that had happened. So were you surprised, before we go to IVF and mifepristone or whatever, were you surprised about what happened in Kansas, where Kansas actually won constitutional amendment that summer on abortion? Did that surprise either one of you?
I think the first time it happened, it surprised me a little bit. But then when we saw what happened in Ohio and here in Wisconsin, we actually had a judicial race in April of 2023 that was largely seen as a race about abortion. Of course, not explicitly, but that was one of the main issues that was being discussed at the time. And happy to say Judge Janet Protasewicz won by a landslide in Wisconsin in that election. And, because of that, the Wisconsin State Supreme Court is going to be making a lot of positive changes. So maybe the first time, pleasant surprise. But after that, it became so apparent to us so quickly that people want abortion access. People believe that abortions need to be safe and legal and accessible. So it's very clear that the electorate is behind this issue.
Yeah, I'd say the same. Well, for me, it was like relief. And then when you saw what happened afterwards, it was like, okay, like these minority voices do not speak for the majority of people.
Let me ask the political question. Do you think this will be a political issue? I know it sounds silly the way I'm asking it, but I'm asking it this way for a reason. Do you think this is going to be a political issue in 2024?
I need it to be, actually. I mean, it's not just women's rights that are under attack here. And I get it. I may have my own criticisms of some of the things that are happening right now within my Biden administration, but it is not, I think, comparable what would happen between the Trump administration versus the Biden administration. It's not even comparable. And on the Biden administration on this issue, it's 100%, in the right place. And so, I think we need to think about this not only as a women's rights issue, but it's an economic justice issue too, for sure. Healthcare issue, 100%. But we're also talking about the erosion of democracy. And this is about, we're talking about taking away women's rights. It's about taking away freedoms too. And what I see happening is this is just one example of many ways that our freedom and democracy is being eroded. And they should be red flags and warning signs that our democracy is under threat. And that things that we took for granted that, like, of course, this wouldn't happen in the United States, they're happening. And we need to be paying attention.
Yes, I could not agree more. I think this absolutely will be a political issue in 2024. This is not a niche issue. This affects not only women, but families. And as you said, Jessica, it is a threat to democracy. There is a very loud and vocal minority, a small minority, as we just discussed, that is imposing moral conviction and religious conviction on everyone, regardless of if they share that religious conviction. And that is a threat to democracy. So I'm glad you brought that up, Jessica.
It was interesting to me that, and Laura, I think you've seen this play itself out in your local as well. Many of our nurse locals, we're now the second largest nurse union in America. Many of our nurse locals were initially reluctant to take positions. A lot of it, we have a lot of Filipino nurses who are members, and they're just like Jessica, you said, there's been a lot of challenges in terms of religious roles versus versus their individual convictions. And so we could see some sense of saying, well, let's not, before Dobbs was decided, let's be a little careful about this. And what's happened since Dobbs, and Laura, maybe you want to talk about this a little bit more. What's happened since Dobbs is that what nurses and other healthcare practitioners have seen has been such an erosion of their latitude to actually practice good healthcare that our membership basically said, oh no, now is the time. We have seen the effects and the impact, and we are calling it out. And I saw literally a 180 done in 6 months. So maybe you'll talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. There's no question that this has affected the ability to practice good healthcare. When the threat of criminalization is hanging over your head as a healthcare professional, you can't practice freely. You have to. You're not only making decisions based on medical science and what the evidence tells us about our bodies and these different processes that are going on, but you're also taking into consideration this potential threat of going to jail, of having a felony conviction. You can't make the right decisions under those kinds of conditions. And we're seeing it all over the country. There are physicians who are taking care of women who don't know where to draw the line or have to consult lawyers to determine where to draw the line. Because if you're in a state where the only exception to perform an abortion is when the mother or the birthing person's life is at stake, well, when she comes in sick, how sick does she have to get before you can make that decision? Do you have to wait until she's literally on death's door before you make that choice? I mean, as medical professionals, we are trained to look into the future and say, hey, we're seeing some warning signs right now, and we need to intervene before you get that far. But if you're a physician or a nurse trying to make that decision, and you're worried that you could potentially be held criminally liable for that decision, now you have some patients who are potentially ending up in really tough situations where they're very sick and they didn't need to be that sick. And we are seeing it happen. And we're even seeing it affect preventative care too. I mean, there was just a big report out of Louisiana that there's OBGYNs down there who are now refusing to see patients until their second trimester, which is not the medical standard of care. Because the risk of miscarriage is much higher in the first trimester, and those OBGYNs don't want even to potentially risk having to take care of someone going through a miscarriage, because the treatment for a miscarriage looks so similar to an abortion. And those OBGYNs, understandably don't want to take those risks. So even routine preventive care for people going through a pregnancy is being affected by this right now. So it is absolutely a healthcare issue, and it can't be ignored.
And to your point, in 2023, applications for OBGYN residencies in states with abortion bans or restrictions decreased by more than 10%. And my niece just went through her residency in family medicine. And, I remember her discussions post-residency about where she was going to practice. And, she, initially really wanted to practice in places like, where near the Oklahoma border and New Mexico, and thinking about Texas. And then post-Dobbs, she's like, no, I can't. Literally those conversations, hearing her talk about, how am I going to do it? Am I going to be in jail, or I'm going to practice medicine? And nearly half of rural hospitals now lack labor and delivery services. So what we're trying to say to our listeners is, this is not a political battle about abortion. This is a huge issue now about freedom, as Jess said, democracy and healthcare, workers' rights, labor rights, all of this. So I'm going to ask two more questions. Jess, I think BTU, and this is both to Jess and Laura, but we talked a little bit about how the mortality rate is now going in the wrong direction. I mean, literally, the maternal mortality rate going in the wrong direction in America in 2024. But it's even worse in terms of Black women. And so both of you are doing, and I know BTU is actually starting to work on issues about women's health and healthcare, and how do we deal with healthcare inequality. But would you both talk a little bit about what we should be doing, what the union should be doing in terms of educating people about this, and what we should be doing in terms of advocacy?
Sure. I mean, and I was proud of the BTU and AFT Mass were proudly supportive, a part of the Roe Act Coalition in Massachusetts. I do think that passing state level legislation to both protect and expand women's rights and reproductive rights is so important. But I also think that when we're talking about, economic justice issues, or I'm so glad you brought that up, Randi, about the maternal health rate for Black women, it's a huge issue. And when you're restricting healthcare access in even more ways, when the status quo was already not adequately supporting Black women, we have to think about those impacts, right? But and it's not just about the healthcare; it's also an economic justice issue, because a lot of women can't afford the healthcare that they deserve or they need. And when 160,000 women have to cross state lines in order to get the healthcare that they deserve and need, that's a problem. And so, when I think about this, though, I think about all the other laws and policies that AFT's fought for. We just did the panel with Senator Warren about public owned pregnancy, right? Right. Well, that I think is a big issue too for women who are trying to build wealth or just buy a home or make ends meet. And, single moms, to get those loans forgiven, it's life-changing, right? We heard that.
Yeah.
And so there's just so many other ways that our unions can and should be fighting. And, one of the first times I spoke about this publicly too was at the AFL-CIO convention. And I did it because there were a lot of men there. And I wanted to just make a point and say, like,
well, that's an understatement.
that, this is a labor issue. It's not just a niche women's issue. And I remember seeing the Washington Post article too. They actually had a whole series on the male partners and the impacts on them. And, it's not just a women's issue. It impacts all of us.
And I'm so glad that, both of you are saying that and seeing that. And I think that, Laura, Planned Parenthood has a very important role to play in terms of healthcare and women's mortality rates and how we fight for equity in healthcare. So I'm giving you the opportunity to make a plug.
Yeah, absolutely. I will just say I'm not here as an official representative of Planned Parenthood.
I know.
Yeah, I am very.
We're all here as unionists today.
But I am very proud of where I work, and I love what I do, and I love our patients. And we are a safety net organization, and so we see a lot of people who otherwise don't access the healthcare system, and so we do see people who are struggling with poverty or struggling with economic issues. And as you said, Jessica, it is about passing protections for abortion. It's about passing protections for women, but it's also about looking at those economic issues and ensuring that people have access to healthcare, that people have coverage, insurance coverage for their healthcare. We're able to provide healthcare to people who are having to pay out of pocket. And fortunately, we're able to do that because of the way our organization is structured. But some of these people wouldn't be able to afford healthcare anywhere else. So getting health insurance coverage for people is huge. And ensuring that they have access when they need it is really important. And it is also a labor issue. The healthcare industry is already in a crisis in terms of staffing, especially in the wake of the pandemic. And this has introduced additional instability for us. And, this is a unique skill set that we have as people who provide abortion care. And there's not enough of us. So it's a labor issue too. And if we can stabilize our labor conditions, then we're going to be able to adequately staff clinics and provide good care to people.
So this is my last question to both of you, which is, we've now spent about 45 minutes talking about what a terrible decision Dobbs has been and the implications of it. And there's going to be, coming out of Texas, the case on mifepristone. There's going to be, we've now seen what just happened in terms of IVF. We've now seen all these ballot initiatives to try to counteract this. It's interesting to me that Lindsey Graham has not brought what he has routinely said, which is his, full ban in as legislation again this year. But the point I'm trying to make is the effects of Dobbs has been terrible. It's been terrible in terms of healthcare. It's been terrible in terms of choices that families have tried to make or want to make in terms of family planning and when to and how to have a family. It's been terrible in terms of the impact of sexual assault. It's been terrible in terms of labor issues. It's been terrible in terms of mortality issues. It's been terrible. There's not a positive story that has happened since the reversal of Roe. So this may be obvious, but what the heck are these people thinking who are trying to block women from making decisions about their own bodies or block healthcare providers from making decisions about how to help women? What is going on with these people who push forward on their anti-abortion and anti-Roe mantra and all of and now anti-contraception mantra? What is going on? Why are they doing this?
Yeah. So I think that in answering this question, I like to separate out what's happening institutionally versus what's happening for individual people. And I'll speak to the individual people side of things because that's what I do. I provide direct patient care. And I really think that there's a failure of imagination going on. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about what an abortion is and what it entails and why people get them. I will say one thing I am happy about is that I think some of the stigma around abortion is starting to be lifted post Dobbs, because people are talking about it now and people are starting to realize how many people have abortions. Every type of person gets an abortion, and people get them for all kinds of different reasons. And Jessica, thank you for sharing your story. And I'm so grateful to everyone who's willing to share their story, because I think the more that people hear those things, the more they are able to understand why people access this type of care. And I cannot tell you how often somebody comes into our clinic and says to us, I never thought I would need an abortion, but here are my circumstances and here's why I'm here. I mean, that happens almost every day. And the other thing that happens almost every day is someone will be in my recovery room after they've had their procedure and they'll say to me, that was it? That's it? I can't believe how easy that was. I can't believe how quick that was. For a lot of people, abortions are less traumatic than dental work. So oftentimes they're really not as scary as a lot of the misinformation would lead people to believe. So I do think it's a lack of information, a lack of imagination about other people's lives, but also about the possibilities within your own life and about the possibility that you too might need to access this care someday. But I'm happy. I think that's starting to change. So
yeah, that a lot of that resonates with me too. I mean, I was just thinking about, I think religion sometimes plays a role. And, even for myself, I was afraid to tell my parents because they're devout Catholics, right? But I think when they saw that abortion isn't what people think it is, it's like easy. It seems so black and white, but there's so many more nuances than people really realize. I mean, even the phrase like fatal fetal anomaly, there are definitely some anomalies that happen that doctors are sure like that they know what's going to happen, right? But there's so many times too, and even in my case where it was so rare that they were pretty sure, but they weren't totally sure. And that happens all the time in the medical world, is that there's these gray areas and it's not as simple as people think it is. And unless you experience it, you don't necessarily know. And so it's easier to go with the rhetoric than it is to go with the reality. And I think maybe that's in a magnanimous kind of, trying to guessing why this is happening. Maybe that's one of the reasons, like the education piece. But in a more cynical level, I do think that there is a movement to take away people's individual liberties, and that like, unless you do things a certain way that some people think is right or wrong, and again, trying to make this black and white, right and wrong, that like you're wrong. And that's, I think, what's more nefarious is placing your ideas on someone else and taking away their liberty and their freedom. And that's what I think is really more scary than looking at the big picture.
Yep. So as we're closing, and as I get to say thank you so much to Laura and to Jessica. I mean, here, for our listeners, you have someone who is deeply a nurse who has deep experience in obstetrics and postpartum care, and someone who is a teacher who has deep experience in education, and us bringing our personal lives into it as well as our deep experience. How lucky can I be that I get to talk to and have had this 45 minutes or so with both of you, Laura and Jess. And for our listeners, what we try to do today is really go underneath the politics and the top lines about what the impacts of the reversal of Roe has been a year and a half to 2 years later, and not simply how it divests control over the most intimate decisions that families have, that women have, that health practitioners have, but what it's doing in terms of that taking away of individual freedoms, and what this trend is that some people have rights, but others do not. And what we're trying to do as a union, and what we're trying to do on this in Women's History Month, is talk about how everybody should have freedom. whether it's reproductive freedom, whether it's freedom to read a damn book. Everybody should have freedom, and one outside force should not be taking that freedom away, particularly on these most intimate decisions that families make. This year, what we've tried to do in terms of Black History Month and Women's History Month, and we're going to try to do it for all the different months, is to actually go deep in an issue instead of be broad about lots of things. So I really, really, really appreciate Laura and Jess for being on this episode as we're celebrating Women's History Month at AFT, at the Women's History Month section of the AFT.org website. But I just really, really wanted to remind everybody again, Friday, March 22nd, the Shirley movie comes out. Go see it, or, watch it or view it wherever you view things these days. But I really wanted to say to Laura and Jessica, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing and for being just so, I know both of you as remarkable human beings, but I think we really did accomplish what we set out to be in terms of the texture and the importance in so many different ways of the implications of Dobbs and what it has meant. So thank you both so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Union Talk. Remember to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and tune in every other week for a new episode. Thank you, be safe, and be well.